Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into something really fascinating, I think. We're going beyond the typical textbook version of Reconstruction. We're really going to explore what freedom actually meant for African Americans after the Civil War.
And we're fortunate enough to have some really compelling historical slides to guide us along the way.
Right. So we're not just talking dates and names here. We're talking like real glimpses into daily life.
It's almost like stepping into a time capsule, you know?
Yeah.
We see the hopes, the aspirations for this new life, this new beginning, but we also see the weight of the past and how it didn't just magically disappear.
That's so true. So, okay, let's set the scene here. It's 1865, the South is in ruins, millions of people have just been emancipated. Where do we even begin to piece together what this new reality was actually like?
Well, think about it. Millions of people suddenly emancipated,
Hmm.
families torn apart by slavery, and the slides really highlight this deep yearning for family reunification.
Right.
That search for loved ones lost.
Yeah.
And alongside that, establishing schools and churches. These became cornerstones of this new life, reflecting a desire for community and stability.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. But freedom after generations of enslavement? I mean, that must have been way more complicated than just, celebrating, right?
Absolutely. It raised profound questions about identity, about belonging, about what it actually means to be freed. How do you rebuild a life? What does economic independence look like when you've never had control over your own labor? And these are questions that resonate even today.
That's a great point. And it makes me think about Reconstruction itself. I mean, I've always kind of thought of it as this optimistic period, this era of progress. But I have a feeling it's probably a lot more nuanced than that.
Oh, definitely. So from 1865 to 1877, you have the federal government attempting this massive overhaul of the South.
Yeah.
Trying to integrate formerly enslaved people into society. We have the landmark amendments, right? The 13th abolishing slavery, the 14th granting citizenship, and the 15th protecting voting rights for black men. On paper, it looks like a radical shift.
Yeah, but that's where the slides kind of offer this powerful reality check, right? Because we see these legal victories, but then we're confronted with images that show how different daily life really was, like how different it was from the promise of those laws.
Exactly. Discrimination was rampant, violence was a constant threat, and basic rights were challenged at every turn.
Yeah.
And it shows the limits of law, how law can only go so far in changing deeply ingrained social and economic power structures.
So how do we reconcile these two sides of Reconstruction, like the hopeful legal changes and then the harsh reality on the ground?
Right.
How do we hold those two things in our minds at the same time?
Well, part of it is understanding that many in the South actively resisted these changes. They saw granting full citizenship and equality to black people as a direct threat to their own power, their own way of life. And so this resistance, both overt and subtle, created this gap, between what the law said and what people actually experienced.
Okay, that makes sense. And into this incredibly complex landscape, steps Frederick Douglass, a figure who really embodies both the hopes and the struggles of this era.
Douglass is just fascinating, isn't he? Because he wasn't content with just emancipation. He understood that freedom was this ongoing fight. And he pushed for things like land redistribution,
Wow.
arguing that true economic independence was simply impossible without it. Now, this was a radical idea for the time, and it wasn't widely supported, even among abolitionists.
So even within the movement for Black liberation, there were disagreements about what freedom really meant and how to actually achieve it. Like Douglass was looking way beyond the legal aspects.
Exactly. He saw this interconnectedness, this very crucial interconnectedness of political power, social power, and economic power. And his work highlights a really important point. Freedom on paper did not guarantee freedom in practice. And one of the starkest examples of this is how the 13th Amendment itself, while it abolished slavery, it contained this very dangerous loophole.
You're talking about that clause that allowed involuntary servitude as punishment for a crime, right?
Yes.
I mean, on the surface, it seems like a small detail, a minor detail.
But it opened the door for practices like convict leasing, where black people were arrested for minor offenses, often on trumped-up charges, and then leased out to work in conditions that were essentially slavery by another name. And the echoes of this practice, sadly, are still with us today.
Wow. It's like they were handing out a Welcome to Freedom pamphlet with one hand and then a stack of restrictions with the other.
Yeah, it's a really tragic irony.
And it wasn't just convict leasing. I mean, southern states enacted black codes, which severely limited the freedoms of formerly enslaved people.
Right. These codes were all about control. They dictated where black people could live, what jobs they could hold, who they could marry. And if you violated these codes, well, you were right back into that system of forced labor. And we see the impact of these restrictions in the slides depicting those dilapidated homes, those fields. It's a visual reminder of the limited opportunities that were available to black people even after emancipation.
It's just heartbreaking to see these images and think about these families, trying to build a life amidst such incredible obstacles. And I know a lot of people ended up trapped in sharecropping or tenant farming.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people, myself included, might assume that those were at least a step toward land ownership. But looking at these slides, it seems like the opposite was true.
You're absolutely right. Sharecropping in particular often felt like this reincarnation of slavery, just disguised in this slightly different economic package. Landowners would provide the land, the tools, the housing, maybe even seed. And you, as the sharecropper, you'd farm it. And then you would split the profits, usually 50-50.
Right, right. But looking at these slides, I mean, it's obvious that something went wrong.
The devil is in the details. Firstly, those crop prices, they fluctuated wildly. Cotton, for example, could be booming one year, bust the next. So even if you had a good harvest, you might not earn enough to cover your debts to the landowner. And the landowner always controlled the accounting. There was very little transparency.
So even if you were like a really good farmer, a savvy farmer, forces outside of your control could just completely wipe you out.
Exactly. And remember, most black families entering sharecropping, they had nothing. No savings, no assets. So they had to borrow from the landowner for everything, for food, clothing, basic necessities. And those debts just kept piling up.
It's like they were set up to fail right from the very beginning.
In many ways, yes. The system was rigged to benefit the landowner, not the sharecropper.
Yeah.
And those black codes we talked about earlier, they made things even worse.
Right. Those are those restrictive laws, put in place in southern states, right?
Exactly. They restricted movement, so black people couldn't easily leave a bad sharecropping situation. They made it hard to find other work, pushing people back towards plantation labor. And some codes even allowed for the arrest of people who didn't have a labor contract, which, guess what, forced them into these exploitative arrangements.
Wow. It's a vicious cycle. You're free on paper, but economically trapped in this system that looks an awful lot like the slavery it was supposed to replace.
It's a tragic paradox. And that's why Frederick Douglass and others argued so strongly for land redistribution. They knew true freedom required economic power, the ability to control your own labor and destiny. But sadly, that vision never came to fruition.
And that brings us back to those slides. There's this image of a Freedmen's Bureau schoolroom it's really stayed with me. It's so full of hope, these children eager to learn, and it makes the Bureau's demise even more tragic.
It is tragic because the Bureau, despite its limitations, was a lifeline for so many. They not only provided direct aid, but they also facilitated education, legal assistance, and crucially, land ownership in some cases.
Yeah.
And that was a direct threat to the existing white power structure.
So it's dismantling in 1872. That wasn't just about budget cuts or inefficiency. It was a political move, right? A deliberate choice to abandon black communities and just let these systems of exploitation flourish.
I think that's a fair assessment. Without the Bureau's support, black people were left incredibly vulnerable. And as Reconstruction itself unraveled, this new wave of terror really swept across the South.
Yeah.
The rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the intimidation of voters, the attacks on black businesses and communities, it all created this climate of fear and oppression.
And that's really the backdrop for Jim Crow, right? Those laws that formalized segregation and essentially legalized discrimination.
Exactly. Jim Crow was more than just separate water fountains and train cars. It was this comprehensive system that was designed to maintain white supremacy, to relegate black people to second-class citizenship.
And it's all the more insidious because it came cloaked in this language of legality. The Supreme Court even upheld segregation in Plessy v. Ferguson, establishing that infamous separate but equal doctrine.
And what's so striking about the Plessy decision is how it twisted the 14th Amendment, which was intended to guarantee equal protection under the law, to actually justify discrimination. It's a chilling example of how legal systems can be manipulated to uphold injustice.
Wow. So where do we go from here? I mean, we've got this incredibly complex period. The hope, the broken promises of Reconstruction, the economic trap of sharecropping, the legal nightmare of Jim Crow. I mean, how do we even begin to untangle its legacy and connect it to the issues that we're facing today?
Well, I think the first step is acknowledging that this history isn't just something in a textbook. It's alive in our institutions, in our social structures, in the disparities that we see all around us.
So the next time someone says, slavery ended over 150 years ago, get over it. What do we say?
We say that the echoes of that system, of the Jim Crow era that followed, are still very much with us.
Mm.
Look at the racial wealth gap, the mass incarceration of black people, the ongoing fight for voting rights. These aren't isolated issues. They are directly tied to the historical injustices that we've been discussing.
It's like that William Faulkner quote, "The past is never dead. It's not even past."
Exactly.
Yeah.
And these slides, these glimpses into the everyday lives of black people during Reconstruction, they remind us that history isn't just about dates and names. It's about real people who struggled, who resisted, who dared to dream of a better future.
And their stories, their experiences, they deserve to be heard and understood, not just as a history lesson, but as this foundation for building a more just and equitable future.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Welcome back. Picking up where we left off, in part one, we saw how freedom after the Civil War was this really tangled mix of hope and hardship.
Yeah.
Those legal promises of Reconstruction clashing with the realities that black people actually faced on the ground.
Yeah, and one of the things that really stuck with me was how these economic systems like sharecropping that were meant to offer a path forward, they often just ended up reinforcing the inequalities of the past.
Yes.
And I'd love to dig into that a little bit more.
Sure.
Because I feel like, a lot of us, we have this kind of vague idea of what sharecropping was.
Right.
But the actual mechanics of how it trapped people in debt.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm really curious about.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because on the surface, it sounds almost reasonable.
Yeah.
The landowner provides land, tools, housing, maybe even seed.
Yeah.
And you, as the sharecropper, you get to farm it.
Right.
And then you split the profits.
50-50.
Usually, yeah.
Okay.
But looking at these slides, it's obvious that something went terribly wrong.
Right. Something went very wrong. What was it?
Well, the devil was in the details.
Okay.
Firstly, those crop prices, they fluctuated wildly.
Yeah.
Cotton, for example, could be booming one year and then bust the next.
Wow.
So even if your harvest was good, you might not earn enough to even cover your debts to the landowner.
Oh, wow.
And the landowner, of course, always controlled the accounting.
Right.
Very little transparency.
So even if you were like a really savvy farmer, forces outside of your control could just completely wipe you out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And remember, most black families entering sharecropping, they had nothing.
Right.
No savings, no assets.
Yeah. Right.
They had to borrow from the landowner for everything.
Yeah.
Food, clothing, basic necessities.
Yeah.
And those debts just kept piling up.
Yeah. It's like they were set up to fail right from the very beginning.
In many ways, yes. The system was rigged to benefit the landowner,
Yeah.
not the sharecropper. And those black codes that we talked about earlier, those made things even worse.
Right. Those were those restrictive laws,
Yes.
put in place in southern states.
Exactly. They restricted movement.
Right.
So black people couldn't just easily leave a bad sharecropping situation.
Right.
They made it hard to find other work, pushing people right back towards plantation labor.
Yeah.
And in some codes even allowed for the arrest of people
Wow.
who didn't have a labor contract,
Oh, wow.
which, guess what, forced them into these exploitative arrangements.
It's just it's a vicious cycle.
It is.
You're free on paper, but economically trapped in this system that looks an awful lot like the slavery that it was supposed to replace.
It's a tragic paradox. And that's why Frederick Douglass and others, they argued so strongly for land redistribution.
Right.
They knew that true freedom required economic power.
Right.
The ability to control your own labor and your own destiny. But sadly, that vision never came to fruition.
Yeah, and that brings us back to those slides. There's this image of a Freedmen's Bureau schoolroom
Yes.
that has just really stayed with me.
It's a powerful image.
It's so full of hope, these children eager to learn.
Yeah.
And it makes the Bureau's demise even more tragic.
It is tragic because the Bureau, despite its limitations,
Yeah.
it was a lifeline for so many.
Yeah.
Not only did they provide direct aid,
Mm-hmm.
but they also facilitated education, legal assistance, and crucially,
Yeah.
land ownership in some
Mhm.
cases. And that was a direct threat to the existing white power structure.
So it's dismantling in 1872. That wasn't just about, budget cuts or inefficiency.
Right.
It was a political move, right? A deliberate choice to abandon Black communities
Mhm.
and just let these systems of exploitation flourish.
I think that's a very fair assessment.
Yeah.
Without the Bureau's support,
Yeah.
Black people were left incredibly vulnerable.
Yeah.
And as Reconstruction itself unraveled, this new wave of terror really swept across the South.
Yeah.
The rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the intimidation of voters, the attacks on Black businesses and communities, it all created this climate of fear and oppression.
And that's really the backdrop for Jim Crow, right?
Yes.
Those laws that formalized segregation
Yeah.
and essentially legalized discrimination.
Exactly. Jim Crow was more than just separate water fountains and train cars.
Right.
It was this comprehensive system
Mm.
designed to maintain white supremacy,
Yeah.
to relegate Black people to second-class citizenship.
And it's all the more insidious because it came cloaked in this language of legality.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court even upheld segregation in Plessy v. Ferguson,
Yeah.
establishing that infamous separate but equal doctrine.
And what's so striking about the Plessy decision
Yeah.
is how it twisted the 14th Amendment,
Yeah.
which was intended to guarantee equal protection under the law,
Right.
to actually justify discrimination. It's a chilling example of how legal systems can be manipulated to uphold injustice.
So where do we go from here? I mean, we've got this incredibly complex period.
Yeah.
The hope, the broken promises of Reconstruction, the economic trap of sharecropping, the legal nightmare of Jim Crow.
Right.
How do we even begin to untangle its legacy and connect it to the issues that we're facing today?
Well, I think the first step is acknowledging that this history isn't just something in a textbook.
Okay.
It's alive in our institutions, in our social structures, in the disparities that we see all around us.
So the next time someone says, slavery ended over 150 years ago, get over it.
Mm-hmm.
What do we say?
We say that the echoes of that system, of the Jim Crow era that followed, are still very much with us. Look at the racial wealth gap,
Yeah.
the mass incarceration of Black people, the ongoing fight for voting rights.
Right.
These aren't isolated issues.
Yeah.
They're directly tied to the historical injustices that we've been discussing.
Right. It's like that William Faulkner quote, "The past is never dead. It's not even past."
Exactly. And these slides, these glimpses into the everyday lives of Black people during Reconstruction,
Yeah.
they remind us that history isn't just about dates and names.
Yeah.
It's about real people who struggled, who resisted, who dared to dream of a better future.
And their stories,
Mhm.
their experiences, they deserve to be heard and understood.
Now,
Not just as a history lesson,
Right.
but as this foundation for building a more just and equitable future.
I couldn't agree more.
As you've been talking about Reconstruction and Jim Crow, I keep thinking about those slides we've been looking at.
Yeah, they really do offer such a powerful visual counterpoint to those, sometimes dry historical narratives.
Exactly. Like, we can talk about sharecropping all day long,
Mhm.
but then you see that image of a family huddled in a dilapidated shack,
Right.
barely scraping by.
It makes the human cost of these policies so much more real, doesn't it? Resilience that you see in those faces.
Yeah.
The determination. It's inspiring, but it's also just heartbreaking knowing the systemic barriers that they faced.
And it's not like those barriers just magically disappeared when Jim Crow ended.
Not at all. The legacies of that era, the economic disenfranchisement, the social stigma, the psychological scars, they've been passed down through generations.
So what are we supposed to do with this knowledge? I mean, it's easy to feel overwhelmed, even hopeless, thinking about the scale of these injustices.
Well, I think that the key is to view this history not as a burden, but as this call to action.
Okay.
It's about understanding how the past shapes our present and using that knowledge to create a more just future.
So it's not about guilt or blame,
But about
responsibility.
Exactly. It's about asking ourselves, what systems and structures are still perpetuating inequality today?
Yeah.
And how can we dismantle them?
And I think these slides, they also remind us that change is possible.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because when you look at the progress that was made during Reconstruction, those brief moments when freedom really felt tangible,
Yeah.
it shows that even in the face of immense opposition, positive change can happen.
But it requires constant vigilant, right?
Like,
Because, I mean, as we've seen, those gains can be so easily eroded if we're not actively fighting to protect them.
that's why it's so important to connect these historical dots.
Right.
To understand how something like the Black Codes, for instance, laid the groundwork for mass incarceration.
Yeah.
How the denial of economic opportunity during Reconstruction contributed to the racial wealth gap that we see
Yeah,
today.
it's all connected, isn't it?
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
And recognizing those connections, that's essential for creating effective solutions.
So what does that look like in practice? I mean, what can we as individuals do to dismantle these systems of oppression that have been around for so long?
Well, I think it starts with education,
Okay.
with being informed about this history,
Yeah.
not just, the sanitized version,
Okay.
but the raw, uncomfortable truths.
The real story.
Yes. And then it's about engaging in those, sometimes difficult conversations,
Yeah.
challenging our own biases,
Mm.
and speaking out against injustice, wherever we see it.
And it's about being allies.
Right.
Amplifying the voices of those who are still marginalized.
Absolutely. And it's about supporting organizations and initiatives that are working to create a more equitable society, whether
Yeah.
that's through policy reform, community organizing, or economic empowerment programs.
Yeah. There's so much work to be done, but I feel like this deep dive has given me, a much clearer sense of where to even begin.
I think that's the power of engaging with history in a meaningful way.
Yeah.
It not only illuminates the past,
Right.
but it also empowers us to shape the future.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive.
Yes, I think so.
I want to thank you so much for joining me on this journey.
It's been a privilege to explore this topic with you.
And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity,
Yes,
challenged your assumptions,
absolutely.
and left you with a renewed sense of hope and responsibility.
Remember, the fight for justice, it's a marathon, not a sprint.
That's so true.
Every step we take, every voice we raise, it brings us closer to that more equitable future we're all striving for.
Thank you for listening.